Hi, I'm Yaakov Katz, and welcome to another episode of the Jewish People's Podcast by JPPI. Zoran Mamdani's victory in New York was celebrated by parts of the progressive movement as a win for justice. But for many Jews, it marked something else, a moment when anti-Zionism fully entered the American political mainstream. In the aftermath of that win, many American Jews are asking hard questions. What happens when the movement they helped build begins to turn on them? My guest today is Rabbi Ammiel Hirsch, senior rabbi of the Stephen Wise Free Synagogue on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. He has been warning about this shift for years. Rabbi Hirsch is one of the clearest moral voices today in American Judaism, has become a conscience for liberal Jews who refuse to surrender their identity, their Judaism, and their connection to the State of Israel. In our conversation, I talk with Rabbi Hirsch about Mamdani's rise, what it reveals about the crisis of liberalism and the progressive movement in America, but also among Jews, why Jewish peoplehood must remain at the center of the reform movement as well as the connection with the State of Israel, and how leadership can rebuild moral confidence in an age when standing with Israel has become so controversial. Because I think we all know, and we hear this from Rabbi Hirsch, if Jews lose the courage to stand unapologetically for who they are and for the state that embodies their people's rebirth, then the battle for justice itself becomes hollow. You'll want to listen to this conversation. Rabbi Ammiel Hirsch, it's really a pleasure to have you on the JPPI podcast. And we've known each other for quite a while, and you've hosted me before, and now I get the privilege and honor of hosting you. So it really is a distinct honor to have you join me today in this conversation. And I'm going to jump right into it. You were very explicit and very clear about the dangers and the risks of the election of Zoran Mamdani as mayor of New York City. He has now been elected. We're just over a week since his election. What does this tell you about what's happening in the United States of America? Well, how concerned are you about what's happening in your own city as a resident, as a leader, as a rabbi, as a leader of the Jewish community? And what does it tell you about the potential for an increase in anti-Semitism?
So to answer that question might take a couple of hours, and you'll have to guide me and stop me on the way. By the way, it's good to see you again, Yaakov, and congratulations on that new fabulous book that
Thank you.
You co-wrote. So on the positive side, the people have spoken. That's important in democracies. There was no accusation of unfairness. Mamdani, in a three-way race, won just over 50% of the vote. And he reached people in a very deep way, including younger people who came out in far greater percentages than I think ever before, but certainly in recent times, to vote for the mayoral election. So that's always positive, and these were free and fair elections. Because they were free and fair elections, and they represented the fair opinions of the majority of New Yorkers, there's a lot for us to worry about. I met him. I spent an hour with him, not alone, but with several other rabbis. It's not coincidental that he won the elections and appeared like a comet out of nowhere. Just, 6, 8 months ago, 10 months ago, he was polling at 1%. And the reason he won was, one, his ideas resonated with people, and two, his personality. He is young. He mobilized a lot of youthful energy. He campaigned in very creative ways. And he's very charismatic and connects with people.
Just to be clear, though, you met him before the election, not after the election.
Met him after the primaries and before the general election. He connects with people in a very deep way. And because he is such a skilled politician and very verbally proficient, very eloquent, I worry about a number of things. Of course, the elections are always about many things. They're not only about one thing. And that's what the voters voted upon too. There were not a lot of single issue voters. But for me, there is a threshold issue in terms of being a Jewish leader and in terms of the interests of the Jewish community, that if you can't get beyond the threshold issue, everything else kind of pales and becomes very complicated and very difficult. The three areas where his election is really quite astonishing is, first of all, he has practically no management experience, and he will soon be managing possibly the most complicated political bureaucracy in the United States. And that's really quite astonishing. The second thing is he's a socialist in the most capitalistic city in the history of civilization. And the third is he's an anti-Zionist in the city where the most Jews in the world live. The more Jews live in New York than Jerusalem. So those were there were issues of affordability, all kinds of local issues on transportation, poverty, and so on and so forth. The threshold issue for the Jewish community, however, was he is a committed anti-Zionist ideologue. This is not simply, and he was raised this way from childhood. He, as Yitzhak Shamir used to say on anti-Semitism and the Poles, he drank this ideology through his mother's milk. He was raised with it. So we've never had that before. And that is deeply concerning, should be, first and foremost, of course, to New York citizens in general, in the manner that I'll explain to you momentarily, but of course to Israelis as well, which I will also go into detail if you're interested. But what we know about the history of anti-Zionism from the outset, from its foundation in the late 19th, but basically early 20th century, is wherever anti-Zionism has been normalized and propounded by key social institutions, especially if it's advanced by high elected officials or high political officials. As night follows day, anti-Semitism increases. The environment is more hostile to Jews. We've seen that in the last 2 years in what we thought were havens of liberal thought.
Right.
And liberal culture, like universities, like legal institutions, international institutions, civil rights organizations, all these areas where Jews found historically a home, because these were organizations that propounded a liberal worldview where most American Jews understood Jewish values to be, and they also felt that liberalism was the best protector of the well-being of American Jews. So we've seen throughout liberal institutions and on the streets of New York and other places in the United States and the West, that wherever this kind of intense hostility to the Zionist idea and now to the state of Israel is allowed to spread and is advanced by important public figures, authority figures in a certain degree, hostility to Jews increase, and it becomes more dangerous to live Jewish lives. And that's what I primarily fear, not because Zoran Mamdani is simply a critic of Israel, which he is. He's a very harsh critic of Israel. But harsh criticism, even unfair criticism, is completely legitimate. What Zoran Mamdani is, however, is a BDS, Students for Justice in Palestine, anti-Zionist ideologue. And that parallels the ideological worldview of Israel's most severe opponents that Israelis are dealing with every day and that you wrote about and you're an expert in. It parallels an Islamist type of ideology. I'm not suggesting that Mamdani himself wants to see Jews in New York City in pain or suffer. I don't believe he's that way, and I don't believe that he wants that. But if I'm right about the nexus, the connection between anti-Zionism as an ideology and its spread in Western society and the increase in anti-Semitism, then we have much to be worried about. And that's what I...
So if we crystallize it for a moment, it's this concern that the rise of a politician who is so stridently anti-Zionist will lead to an even greater explosion potentially in New York City, at least if we think just locally for a moment, before we talk about the larger, wider ramifications for your members of the Stephen Wise Free Synagogue, for other Jews who walk through the streets and call New York their home, they could be at greater risk.
I think they will be. Of course, I don't know because it hasn't happened yet, right? And there are New York Jews who support Mamdani and have even been part of the campaign, and they assure us that that's not the case. We'll wait and see. We'll wait and see how seriously he uses the bully pulpit and various leverage that the New York City mayor has, like in education, for example, to see how centrally he advances this anti-Zionist ideology. He has said many times that anti-Zionism is a driving force of his political worldview and is one of the key reasons that he is a politician in the first place. So that too,
not to mention how much he spoke about Israel on the campaign trail, right?
Right.
I mean,
and
not that Israel has anything to do with New York mayoral politics, but
But as a teenager, he gets to Bowdoin College, which is an elite liberal arts college in Maine, very hard to get into, and he grew up amongst many New York Jews in an elite high school, by the way, in New York City, Bronx Science Public School, and among the first things he does when he gets to Bowdoin College is co-found the Students for Justice in Palestine chapter, which is a virulently anti-Zionist organization with a virulently anti-Zionist ideology, and that was 16 years ago. That was 14 years before October 7th. So we don't know, but I think there is significant reason to be concerned. And when we met with him, and he said this publicly as well, and asked him to respond to our anxiety about the increase of anti-Semitism as a result of his anti-Zionist ideas, his response was he doesn't want to have anti-Semitic incidences in the city. He condemns them. As I said before, on that level, I took that answer at face value. I don't believe that he is seeking to harm New York Jews at all. As a person, I don't think he's that kind of person. But he also said, if and when necessary, not only is he not going to reduce security around Jewish institutions, he might actually increase security around Jewish institutions if necessary. And I took that answer at face value too, because one, as I said, I don't think he's that kind of person. But secondly, and even more importantly, it's not in his political interest to reduce security around Jewish institutions. If chas v'chalila, right, heaven forbid, there was an attack and mass casualties in a Jewish institution, and the
it would
reason
be blamed on him potentially, and it would have political fallout.
And it would seriously set back the mayoralty as well as the brand that he and his allies are trying to build. But the point is this: you could put 50 police officers outside our building. One, you can't put 50 police officers every day outside our building, and if you put 50 police officers here, they're not going to be in other Jewish institutions. And two, if I'm right about the connection between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism in terms of creating a more hostile environment, then all Jews every day will be under more serious risk. And that's the main threat in my view. Now, we take an issue, for example, where the mayor does have influence, like the Department of Education, which oversees what 1 million New York young students study. If he appoints a director of the Department of Education who himself is an anti-Zionist, that's what New York young students will be studying. So there is a tremendous amount of influence here, and it should be really worrying, because it legitimizes and normalizes this ideology of anti-Zionism that 10 years ago nobody could even dream of being elected the mayor of New York if they had those ideas.
I think what's interesting, and definitely maybe New York Jews would know this, and probably a lot of American Jews would know this. I don't think Israeli Jews know this. I mean, what I find interesting about you specifically, you are the leader of a liberal, progressive Jewish community in the Upper West Side of New York City. We're not talking to a firebrand MAGA, Trump supporter, anti-democratic party advocate, right? He's coming from within to some extent, correct me if I'm wrong, Rabbi, coming from within what would be considered the home or the political home of the members of your synagogue, the members of your community. I mean, does that add to the fact that this is so startling and so shocking to some extent?
The truth of the matter is American Jews are still traumatized, still in shock. I think we finally reached October 8th, as you have in Israel. But it's going to take years to figure out and sort out because, as you well know, and you intimated in your question, American Jews overwhelmingly have been supportive of liberal causes, at least since the end of World War II. And that's been portrayed, that's been expressed electorally through support for the Democratic Party as well. But other entities, other liberal institutions, New York City private schools, public schools, universities, these were the havens. Jews contributed disproportionately to all of the liberal institutions, ideologically, i.e. universities and think tanks and so on, as well as social service entities, hospitals and concert halls and so on and so forth. It's hard to conceive that some of these basic civic New York institutions could have actually been built, let alone sustained, without Jewish contributions. So at least since the days of FDR, Jews have been voting electorally overwhelmingly for Democratic candidates at a rate of anywhere between 2/3 and 3/4. And that's not a partisan opinion on my part. I'm just simply observing a fact. For complicated reasons that happy to speak about at length if you would like, we found early on, and there were hints of this before October 7th, that these liberal institutions were distancing from, one, the liberal values that we always assumed constituted the essence of liberalism, and two, consequently, they were moving away from the sensibilities of the Jewish community, and they were moving away from support of Israel to a much more hostile view of the Zionist idea and the state of Israel. And this really exploded. Honestly, if you look back at it, by sundown of October 7th, it was already germinating. And there were signs of this before that I actually spoke about and preached about and wrote about. And so American Jews many American Jews are in shock and dismay and deeply disappointed that these institutions where they have felt at home throughout their entire lives, there's practically no American Jew alive who has experienced this kind of anti-Semitism in their lives. So the American Jewish community is really in deep funk and confused about these liberal institutions, not all of them, but many, if not most of them, who at best disappointed us and at worst actually actively betrayed us. This is bound to have electoral consequences in the years to come. How exactly is hard to say, but we know here, with respect for the race for the mayor, whereas the vast majority of American Jews would have supported the Democratic candidate in the past, apparently under the best of circumstances. I think these polls, it's just an instinct, I'm not a pollster, I think these polls are rather high. They show that a third, 30% of American Jews supported Mamdani. my guess is it's probably around 25% or maybe a little less. But if it's 30%, it's still close to 2/3 of American Jews voted against the Democratic candidate, and it would have been exactly reverse had the Democratic candidate not been as problematic for the Jewish community. It's not, I'm not an outlier, okay? You might have heard about this letter that was signed by now about 1,100 rabbis about a week before the elections. And if you take it wasn't like, you throw out some kind of petition online and you could, in 3 hours, you could get thousands of signatories, okay? So that's what tends to happen. But this letter was different. If you take a look at the rabbis who signed this letter, they form the backbone of American Jewry, of the American Jewish community, ranging across the ideological spectrum, from Orthodox to liberal and so on. And I know I'm in touch with the people. Okay, as you say, it's a historic liberal synagogue on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. And not everyone for sure. We're a famously and beautifully diverse and pluralistic people. But the vast majority of our congregants, and we know, according to the polls, American Jews, agree with my perspective. And they are, at least were up until very recently, and certainly up until October 7th, by a large majority, by at least 2/3, they are and were liberal.
Right.
And voted for liberal candidates.
So it's interesting, though, also, because if I look at the wider context of this mayoral election, in November, so just a year from now, we will have the midterms. And I hear from talking with different Jewish organization leaders, AIPAC-like folks, that there's a concern, and you're already starting to see in certain congressional races and districts and whether Senate races and seats that are now open, different characters and a cast that you didn't used to see running for these public offices. People who are anti-Zionist, some of them anti-Semitic. We know of course, the Squad, but we could find ourselves potentially in a situation where the Squad now doubles or triples or quadruples, and that the Mamdani election and victory might be a sign that this is what's coming potentially for the United States of America and for some of these elections. I know that there's some hope, and you mentioned this, Rabbi Hirsch, that, look, he has a huge task ahead, which is running a massive city, hundreds of thousands of employees, $100 and something billion budget. If he doesn't succeed, that would kind of take the air out of that potential balloon from going up in the air. But I'm curious where you are on that. Do you see the wider national concern here for what's coming in just a year from now in the midterms?
Absolutely, and that's Israel's concern too, by the way, because first of all, New York is not just another city. What happens in New York influences the entire Western world, and certainly the United States. And what the election of an anti-Zionist ideologue telegraphs to the political establishment is not only is anti-Zionism, this kind of hostility towards Israel, a disadvantage, it could actually be a winning ticket. You could not only win elections in, of all places, New York City, but it might actually be to your political advantage to express this kind of hostility to Israel. And everybody's watching. Everybody's watching in the Democratic Party, which is already increasingly influenced by these hard left forces. And there's a growing problem in the Republican Party as well. And Mamdani's victory, they're looking at these elections too. And Mamdani's victory telegraphs to them that there's may not be an electoral price to pay for a very hard anti-Israel approach. In fact, it might be... And
by the way, we're seeing that already happening on the conservative right-wing side. I mean, look what's happening with the Heritage Foundation, Tucker Carlson. All that is just another manifestation of what you're talking about.
That's right. So I think there's a lot to worry about. It'll be very interesting. Of course, as I said before, elections are run on a whole host of issues, and by the time we get to the midterms in November, I imagine it'll be basically a vote on Trump and on the policies of Trump, and there was recently a election along with the New York mayor. There were elections for governors and various other little elections around the United States, and the Democrats swept those elections, and they were basically it was perceived and interpreted as an anti-Trump vote. And if that's still the atmosphere in November, then you might see certainly the Democrats taking control of the House of Representatives and maybe also the Senate, although that would be much harder. So here's the thing with Israel, Yaakov. Israel has its own domestic policies. It chooses its representatives. Presumably, those representatives make policy determinations, including when to go to war and how to wage that war, based on a whole myriad of political, security, economic, and diplomatic and other factors. And that's what we pay them for. That's their job, to take all of that into account and to make what they consider to be the best decisions in the national interest of the State of Israel. One of those factors should be, what is the impact on our standing in the West? And also, of course, since Israel defines itself as the national home of the Jewish people and considers itself the protector of world Jewry, one factor, I'm not saying where it should rise to the level of importance, but a factor needs to be, what is the impact on world Jewry of the decisions we're making? And even more important from the Israeli political and national interest perspective, what is the impact on our standing in the West in who we go to war with, when we go to war, and how we wage that war? And if what we're seeing is rightly or wrongly, fairly or unfairly, as a result of this war, Israel's standing has diminished and decreased in the West. That's bound to have electoral consequences that are negative for the Israel-American bilateral relationship. And eventually, it will take a toll on the entire panoply of support that Israel receives from the West, economically, politically, diplomatically, militarily. So Israelis really need to internalize that at the end of the day, this is my view, maybe political analysts, and you're one of them, maybe you see it differently, but I see it this way, and I'm not a political analyst, so correct me if I'm wrong, but at the end of the day, Israel's well-being is connected in a very significant way to its reputation and standing in the West as a fellow democracy that shares our values. If fairly or unfairly, rightly or wrongly, Israel's reputation is undermined, that's bound to have negative consequences on Israel.
I totally agree with you, Rabbi Hirsch. I mean, there's no doubt in my mind you're 100% right. What I'm curious is, do you think Israelis, I don't think Israelis understand this. And it's something that I've been writing about and talking about as well. And definitely when it comes to the United States, I mean, we've seen what's happened over the last 2 years, how we have lost. I mean, look what's happened to us in Europe. Look what's happened to us with friends of ours that we thought we had in Canada or Australia and France and the UK. The one ally we have, and whether we like Biden or we didn't, or we like Trump or we don't, the United States is a constant for Israel. It's up and down sometimes, but it's a constant. And that's changing. And what we're talking about is maybe even a further, deeper, more substantive change. I don't think Israelis fully get it. And I'm wondering how you feel on that, and what more can be done to maybe wake up the leadership in this country and where I am for us to better understand what's coming.
First of all, you're better equipped to answer that than I am. You're in Israel, and you influence public opinion and policymakers to a certain degree. This Mamdani election was a wake-up call. Okay, it's not just a minor thing, and we'll get over it. And anyway, when the prime minister comes to New York, nobody's going to arrest him. Okay, it's not simply that. It's something very deep along the lines of your questions and this discussion that we've been having over the last 10 minutes or so. There's an election coming up in Israel sometime within the next year, sometime during 2026. And it should be part of the equation. I remember previous elections way back in the 20th century, where Israelis rendered a political verdict based on their perspective of how the prime minister managed the American-Israel relationship. And it should be a factor. Again, how important that factor should be, is for Israelis to decide. But these very extreme forces in the Israeli government with very extreme rhetoric and very morally problematic actions, like the stuff that's been going on in the West Bank recently, and most immediately, we're recording this the day after really very serious violence.
No, it's horrific what's happening there, and the lack of rule of law is just inexcusable. 100%.
So this impacts on Israel's relationship with the rest of the world.
But it also, what I'm hearing from you, Rabbi Hirsch, is that it also impacts what you're saying to some extent. Is you're saying Israeli leaders, at least, wake up. This impacts our security. It impacts the future welfare of Jews in the United States of America.
Well, it definitely impacts Israel. I mean, look, Israel needs to do what it needs to do. Most American Jews are liberal. Israel, I would say, I think you could describe Israel as a center or center-right country, at least as it's been reflected electorally over the last period of time. And so there's bound to be tension built in right then and there. Okay, and then you add the religious pluralism issue and the Haredi issue. You have a lot of built-in tension right there and then. Israel needs to make its own decisions, and the rest of world Jewry needs to learn to live with that, because that's the democratic verdict and that's the rules of the game. But I can just simply say, it's not only American Jewry, 2/3 of whom describe themselves as liberal, that are concerned about these extreme forces in the government. It's everybody in the West, including Israel's friends. There's nobody in the West who comes out and says, I'm a supporter of Ben Gvir, or I'm a supporter of Smotrich. Nobody. At most, what we can expect from our friends is not to talk about it. Okay? So it is a really serious issue. And I think Israelis understand that, by the way. I think broadly speaking, they still understand that the way they are perceived in the West has direct national ramifications. Even if you leave aside, it's less compelling. Israelis are great, beautiful people, and they do care about each other, and they do care about fellow Jews abroad. And their sensitivity to the connection between Jews abroad and themselves has increased. Their respect for that relationship has increased since October 7th. So they know it now more than ever, okay? But even if you leave all that aside, and that's kind of ideological, and that's communal, and that's covenantal, even if you put all that aside, you just look at it from a raw political and a security perspective. I think they do understand that their standing in the West, Israel's standing in the West, bears substantially on the well-being of Israel's security and economy. I think they do understand that, but there's so many issues in Israel every day, and the way politics is practiced in Israel is so unique and so urgent every day that maybe this issue, because it's a little more distanced, has less impact than during the old days when, before social media, there was one television channel and you could kind of focus on issues.
Rabbi, you said before you're not an outlier, but I think where you might be an outlier, correct me if I'm wrong, is that even before October 7th, you were one of the I don't want to say few rabbis from the Reform movement, but definitely a leading voice on the Reform movement who constantly spoke about Israel, who constantly defended Israel, who constantly pushed the importance of the Israel diaspora relationship, even at times when Jews across the United States and within the Reform tent wanted to move away, when other rabbis were saying, listen, it's not good for me. It's not good for my career to talk about Israel. It's better for me to stand at the pulpit, talk about something else, talk about the World Series or whatever issue it might be, but I don't want to talk about Israel because I can't go right with Israel. But you kept going head on. I'm curious, with everything that we've been through now in 2 years, and we're also talking about a period where the war is, to some extent, to the most part, over. We'll wait to see how this all plays out. How is talking about Israel today different for you than maybe it was over the last 2 years in this kind of post-war moment? And do you think that the obviously October 7th awakened within everyone this need to engage, but are we possibly going to see now, because of everything we just spoke about, rabbis saying, you know what, we've had those 2 years, of course we had to deal with it, but now let's shut it off again, let's close it off, let's go back to our little silo?
It's a good question. What hasn't happened yet, it's hard to say what will happen. First of all, I'm not an outlier in the rabbinate either, or in the Reform rabbinate. All of your listeners should appreciate, most American Jews support what I've said and support my perspective. Most Reform Jews support what I've said and support my perspective, and most Reform rabbis do. The challenge is the younger you go generationally, the less true that is. So that by the time you get to, call it 18 to 24-year-olds, some recent polls that I've seen indicate that up to as many as 50% have very problematic views of Israel. Either anti-Zionist or they're so hostile to Israel that for all intents and purposes, it's the same thing. And that's the big challenge moving forward. And one, I think that has ramifications for all of the Jewish institutions to, for example, in rabbinical schools, we have an internal debate in the Reform movement, and I'm very strong in demanding that our rabbinical school not ordain anti-Zionists, because not that anti-Zionism, people who are anti-Zionists aren't free to voice their opinions. Of course they are. And if there's a Jewish community that wants to form a synagogue and they want to hire an anti-Zionist rabbi and they can find somebody like that, terrific. They let them do it. I'm not against that. We don't have to ordain them because we are a Zionist movement. And if you don't set standards, if everything goes, nothing goes. And on the issue of Zionism, that's the threshold issue also theologically for us, it seems to me. So that's the challenge moving forward, is with respect to how to avoid the phenomenon that we've seen and that has exploded. In other words, it came into focus and clarity as a result of October 7th, that so many young people are so hostile to Israel. And some of them claim, and I take what they say as sincere, because I always assume the benefit of the doubt when people say that what their motivations are. They say that some of them say that they have reached this kind of hostility to Israel as a result of what we taught them. That, for example, thousands of them came to us with complaints, alumni of Reform, young alumni of Reform synagogues, and said, you taught us tikkun olam meaning repair of the world, i.e. the universal impulse of Judaism, which is definitely in Judaism throughout our experience, including at the very beginning of Judaism itself, when God says to Abraham, I shall make of you a great nation, and I will bless you, v'nivrechu v'cha kol mishpachot ha'adamah. All the families of the earth will bless themselves through you. So right there you have this unique, miraculous blend in Judaism between what we call today universalism and particularism. But to the extent that we have alumni who tell us, you abandoned your own principles because we formed this anti-Zionist approach because of what you taught us to be concerned about the rest of the world and to be concerned about tzedek, mishpat, tzedakah, so on and so forth. Then we have to do some self-reflection on our part as well. And we have to ask ourselves, what exactly were our objectives? What did we teach? And what did we misteach? So, for example, if they come to us and they're saying, we're pursuing these anti-Israel ideas and actions because of the concept of tikkun olam that you taught us, we obviously mistaught the concept of tikkun olam, and so we have to make a correction ourselves. This is the key. I don't think that people move all the time, and I was young once too, and I believe a lot of things now that I didn't believe back then, and vice versa. So some people are going to move back and forth, and some people will come back to us on their own when they have families, when they have mortgages, and all that. But I can't bring them back. I can't bring anti-Zionist Jew who's committed ideologically to this and is marching with BDS and is doing encampments on university campuses with Students for Justice in Palestine. I don't think I can bring them back. I don't close my doors to anybody. I don't cancel anybody. I have had anti-Zionist Jews who've heard me say this and have come and spoken with me, and I've always spoken with them, thinking that if they want to speak with me, maybe they're open to some counter argument, and at least it'll start a process. But for me, I have limited capacity and limited resources to even attempt to bring those Jews back into the fold. I'm not against other people trying who have more resources and more skill than I do in this respect. What I am focusing on now is the next generation. First of all, the parents of these kids, many of whom are deeply conflicted about where their kids are, and what we call Gen Alpha, right? The teenagers coming up now. And with them, it's definitely not too late. So all of these things we need to be taken into account and factored in by us. But I just want to make one additional key point. I have always felt, and I feel now, mindful of everything I said. Remember, you have a Gen Z person, a Jew who's in his 20s, 22, 25, 28, 30 years old. They've essentially, and they're liberal, and they've essentially grown up with right-wing Israeli governments. And the only prime minister they know is Prime Minister Netanyahu, whose standing is quite problematic here in the West. So there are all kinds of factors, simple at all. But mindful of all of this, I've always believed that the main factor that defines the Israel-diaspora relationship on the part of diaspora Jews is connection to Judaism. If you identify with Judaism deeply, chances are you will identify with the Jewish state deeply, even if you have very severe criticisms of its policies and its government. And that was, in my view, and remains the central challenge of the American Jewish community. The levels and the scope of Jewish illiteracy is just simply astounding. And unless and until we can get these Jews into a better, deeper relationship with Jewish institutions and a better, deeper understanding of Judaism, I fear that we're going to see these kinds of reflections of that Jewish illiteracy as it relates to the Jewish state as well.
Rabbi Hirsch, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to join me. Your clarity, your sincerity, your courage on these issues, I think they're, at least for me, they're rare and they're deeply needed. And I appreciate your honesty. I've been able to see your leadership up close in New York, missions you brought to Israel. And I know that the thought that you bring to the conversation is never simple, but as we both know, it's essential for all of us Jews and essential for the Israel diaspora relationship, which I know is deep and deeply important to you and, of course, to me as well. So I want to thank you so much again for taking the time to speak to me.
It's my pleasure. It's always a treat to be able to dialogue.
Thank you. Thank you for joining me on today's episode. As always, you can find us where podcasts can be found on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, the website of Times of Israel. Give us a 5-star ranking. Share this conversation with Rabbi Hirsch, with people who you think will be interested. It's extremely important. Wishing you rest of a good week. Have a great weekend. We'll see you back here very soon.